Okay. Rinne úsle, bhil an fáilte mhór a chorúbar fad an seo, go dtíon chéad ulchuinú taid de chuid rinne idechais agus óige an seo I Barca Chróca. So, ladies and gentlemen, and all those watching online, we are delighted to welcome you all to this first annual Research Summit of the Department of Education and Youth. And I do emphasise two words in that, the first and summit, and hope to come to summit in the close of my remarks. We have a really diverse audience here this morning, departmental colleagues, research from across third level, all the universities, teachers, principals, aegis bodies of the department, and many, many others. And for the last couple of weeks, I felt like we've been organising a Coldplay concert here rather than actually a research summit, such as the level of interest and anticipation, and dare I say it, excitement, been. This is the culmination of many, many months, perhaps years of work in many different ways. I want to take you briefly through the background to that and maybe set the scene for the overall event before handing over to our keynote speaker, Professor Selina McCoy. I won't go into the detail of these slides, will be made available afterwards, but we're trying to, when you have a look at these afterwards, really bring home to you all as a community of people in education and youth what we've been doing behind the scenes. And Ian Hughes and Sarah Rochford, the research officers, under the leadership of Pat McCarthy, have been doing all this in terms of internal work in the department, research workshops with colleagues, meetings of our research policy and practice steering group, internal newsletter, a first ever research inventory for ourselves, our aegis bodies. It's a start, going back, I think, 1 or 2 years, and keeping that up to date. So we have an ongoing compendium of the research we're commissioning across the sector and involved in ourselves, and also very practical advice on things like tenders, procurement and research, and trying to up our engagement in that space as well. And also, as today is a very clear manifestation of building connections facing out the way. So connecting with networks that already exist. We're trying to kind of, as we discussed at our knowledge brokerage, our people brokerage event back in February, making a network of networks. So supporting colleagues across the department in enhancing, not working from ground zero, but enhancing those connections and new strategic partnerships with the likes of Tides of Erin, Horizon Europe, ESRI, Learnovate, etc. Those of you here at the February event will recall that sense of excitement and energy too, and that was very much focused on, I suppose, building the personal connections in the first instance, a people brokerage event, and working very closely with the IUA and the TUA to create a deliberate diversity of academic expertise, including obviously education faculties, but not just education faculties, to really reach out to other sectors we haven't been perhaps as active in the past, and to kind of leverage the full benefit of the vast breadth and depth of research across the third level and at post-primary and primary teachers as well. There were a number of points, I won't go through all these in detail again, but a number of points came through from that event, if those here might recall. People wanted this network we're launching here this morning to have a future focus, to have a holistic, inclusive approach towards research, to focus on big issues. Multidisciplinarity was very much emphasized, and designed deliberately to help. Sounds simple, but it's not simplistic. That's what we said we wanted back in February. We wanted to build on existing knowledge, the accessibility of research to diverse audiences, including the diversity that is here this morning. And very clearly a sense there for working towards a greater sense of coherence and direction to our really high-performing education system in so many different ways, but clearly there are gaps and challenges remaining to be addressed on an ongoing basis. And not forgetting the international dimension. Ian and Sarah kind of wore out the shoe leather, talking to many of the existing networks, Children's Research Network, DICE, ESAI, the Implementation Network North and South, NERI, the Network for Education Action Research, TREX, Teachers Research Exchange, the Student Teacher Educational Research, the Standing Conference Teacher Education North and South. I'm running out of breath calling these things out. And we even engaged with experts on network theory, an area that's always fascinated me for many, many years. I haven't read an awful lot on it, but I've always been fascinated by its potential to support us in our work and leveraging the connections that already exist. So Martin Brown and Deirdre O'Neill, respectively. And from that engagement with that diversity of existing networks and existing experts, 3 things came back very clearly to us. And we're thinking of trying to convene this new network, establish a summit. What's your thoughts? One, people talked about the convening power of the Department of Education. There's a government department. That call, were it to issue, could have really powerful impact. The idea of linking up and multiplying the individual network impacts that already happen, and that 3-legged stool, really important. People were very welcoming and supportive of that idea, the research policy and the practice space. Our own statement of strategy has this ambition set forth under our current Minister McEntee that education and youth services, policies and strategies are informed by national and international research, evidence and stakeholder engagement, including with children and young people. That diversity of evidence very clearly centre stage in that point. And there's a particular goal, of which today is the outward manifestation, so we can say this is now well on track, to establish a futures-oriented research network that brings together policymakers, researchers in higher education institutions, and practitioners across the education and youth sectors to strengthen the evidence base, to create greater cohesion, there's that word carrying forward, coordination and collaboration. That's what we're doing here today in Croke Park. And a big thank you to the Irish Universities Association and the Technological Universities Association, because I think that engagement and their knowing of their own networks better than we would has been really instrumental, I think, in generating the energy and connections that we see here today and saw back in February. So we're launching FIRU, Realisation, the Gaelic word for realisation, a futures-oriented educational research network for Ireland. Very much against the backdrop of, I think it's and the word that's been coined recently by Friedman, and I'll come to it in a second, the Polyscene. People have the poly crisis, the increasing complexity and intensity of that complexity of the challenge we're facing geopolitically, climate change, socially, etc. And such is that kind of almost overwhelming sense of poly crisis. We need to have not lose sight of there's going to be a tomorrow and a day after and a day after. So we want to strengthen those links with the research policy and practice in that space. And this network we're establishing, this network of networks, is a key part of that. So quoted by Thomas Friedman in a recent article in the New York Times, Eric Beinhocker from the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School. And it might sound like almost stately obvious, but I think it's worth calling to mind. He said, we now operate more and more inside global ecosystems, what he calls dynamic, interdependent webs of knowledge, skills, technology, and trust. I thought that was an interesting word he put at the end of that sentence. I haven't got a chance to talk to what he meant by that, but trust in all of this is important. But let's not forget the creative side of things and the artistic side of things either. So I dipped into the book, The Poetics of Space, written by a guy called Gaston Bachelard. And in the foreword to it, speaking of the author, Martin Danielewski says his distaste, Gaston's, for what impedes in the name of dogma. He, Gaston, values the imagination because he recognizes that understanding without imagination is doctrine without growth. And without growth, what chance is there to engage the complexity that bounds us? So I think that binding complexity echoes Beinhocker's quote I've just cited there. And that idea that we are also creative human beings, no matter what our disciplinary expertise might be. And as we connect in diverse and innovative ways, what imagination might come forth as well, and not to lose sight of that. We all have a pulse, and we all have an emotional space. So this future network we're establishing against that backdrop will have three subseam strands set out at the outset, kind of three slipstreams: future schools, future educational outcomes, and visions for the future system. And also with one eye to the convention education coming next year, and there's a stand on that actually in the stand space you may wish to visit later on over the coffee breaks. You'll be aware of these themes because you all apply to submit under more of those themes, and of course the child or young person at the centre of all of that work. We want to coordinate existing networks and stakeholders. We want to have an annual research summit, work towards a members newsletter, in-person and online events. And we will build towards this over time. We are starting at base camp and expand activities. We see as outcomes of this process increased collaboration and engagement, improved implementation of research findings, innovation, building capacity, as I said at the outset, but not just within the department, but across the sector and between sectors in education, national and local impact, and crucially, building the case for investment in research and education. We have a mountain to climb in education youth in terms of our spend, in terms of research in and of education. And we need to build a global coalition behind that, reaching out to people who mightn't be in this space at all. And in terms of the accessibility of research, that the penny dropping, we need to back this more. Because we're competing in a space for resources, obviously, on an ongoing basis. But even today is a fraction of the breadth and depth of research that already exists. That's our mission statement for the network, that we want to bring together researchers, policymakers, and education practitioners through collaborative inquiry, evidence-informed policy development, sharing of innovative practice, and a focus on implementation, we strive to shape a future-focused education system that prepares children and young people for current and future societal changes. Our goal is to empower every child and young person to achieve their full potential in a never-evolving world. So in more practical matters, membership of this network, these kind of loose connections that network theory would speak of, will be offered to all delegates. So by walking through that door, you are now a member of this network, so congratulations. And all members of existing partner networks. There's literally one for everyone in the audience. There'll be a call for applications to join FEAR through relevant channels by the department, the IUA, and existing partner networks. We'll also be offering membership to teacher educators, teachers, school leaders, registered teaching council and youth work practitioners, staff of the department and of ageist bodies of the Department of Education and Youth, researchers currently employed by a tertiary education institution in Ireland, and staff of affiliate public sector bodies focused on research such as tied to Éireann. We want sustainable growth. We want to work towards our webinar, our newsletter by theme, and hope to establish a coordinated committee in partnership with the institutions I mentioned earlier on. Two quotes before I come to my closing points here. In some of my little spare time for reading, Impossible Creatures is a fantasy novel for children and young people written by Catherine Rundell. And in it, there is a court in the magic land of the archipelago that moves. It travels from town to town. And one of the characters says the point of this court moving is that the truth is always journeying and always ready to be summoned when there's a collective in a space, well-intentioned, but also very knowledgeable. Expertise will always be important. As Andy Hargreaves said, interdisciplinarity respects disciplinarity. So what truth are we going to summon here today? But also that diversity of thought. Jane Hirschfield in a podcast with Ezra Klein saying we must think with the precision of poets and the imagination of scientists. And that word imagination I'm deliberately emphasizing. I want to leave with three then points to close off, hand over to our keynote speaker. Summit, echoes, and belonging. Today is a summit. Any geographers in the audience will also appreciate the summit is the peak of a mountain. And at that peak, you get a sense of the vast landscape of which you have always been a part of. The diversity of the corries, the valleys, the rivers, the forests, etc., the homes you see below you. So what do you see around you in the landscape that you have always been a part of and will always remain a part of? One of the things people love to do in valleys and those spaces or at summits is echoes. And my master's work, it was a one-year partially taught master's. My minor thesis research was on the synthetic form of the verb as an echo form in the Irish of the Aran Islands. So if you say vi me, I was, but in Munster they say vius, they have it in one word, they push it together. But they discovered in the Aran Islands that actually when you're answering a question or a statement to someone else, the Connemara speakers borrow the Munster form, the echo form to respond. You were there, weren't you? Vi tuan noch rotu. And the answer would be vius instead of vi me. And I like that idea of an echo that connects, an echo that unites, an echo that synthesizes. We think of echoes that cast out and disappear into the ether. Here in language, in a very real human interaction, you have an echo that connects. Another heading of connection, if you haven't seen the way in, on the way out, and you can see through the window, we won't see it through here, obviously, with the blind in place, the GAA have a standing declaration, a testimonial to belonging. It's there 24/7. How much time have I got left? I have 1.5 minutes. And the testimonial reads as follows. It's out there, you'll see it on the way home. We all belong here in this place, at this time. We belong not because of who we are or where we come from. Being here means belonging. Belonging means knowing you're part of a community that has a place for all, where potential is nurtured, where individuals become teams, who honor the legacy of those who went before and strive to build a legacy of their own. Some of us play. Some of us used to play. Some of us never played. We all belong. Belonging means having a voice, means being able to say what you think is right, truth, being summoned, being listened to. Belonging means respecting each other, means being there for each other on the pitch and off the pitch. And very small writing, belonging means rolling our sleeves up and doing what needs to be done. We all belong, whether it's our first day or our 100th year. We all belong here because this place, this summit, belongs to us all. I'm going to leave that for a moment because I've got some practical housekeeping matters to attend to after the keynote. We might do the one-word Menti after the keynote, if that's okay, Sarah, whoever is managing that. But bear in mind, what we're asking you throughout this day, as well as contribute and participate, is actually connect and help us connect. So what patterns do you see across the keynote, the presentation, the papers and the sessions? I'll say more about that after the keynote. But please help us connect in as many different ways as you possibly can. We were delighted when we asked Professor Selina McCoy to give us a broader lens perspective. Apologies now. Excellent. From the ESRI and what we're trying to do here, because it's both new and familiar, and we want that kind of external, either critique, interrogation, and hopefully some validation of what we're doing. So I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker and look forward to hearing from her. Professor Selina McCoy, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tomas. I'm honoured to be invited to give the keynote at what is, I think, a really significant day in Irish education and education research in particular. So I'm going to quickly outline how I'm going to tackle this keynote address. I'm going to start with just a very quick reflection on some key moments in education research in our history, which I think have been fundamental in shaping where we are today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the growing and the really healthy appetite for evidence-informed policy in Ireland and across Europe. And I'm going to then take you through what I think are the two main strands in the research that we do. So kind of the more quantitative evidence-informed work we do, and the more nuanced and qualitative work that a lot of the research community in Ireland are involved in. And I think it's a very exciting space at the moment. And then I'm going to wrap up and kind of highlight what I think are kind of some future directions. So in terms of the history, I think I would have to mention the investment in education piece in 1965. It was really instrumental in shaping our education system, but also our drive for evidence and understanding how different groups of young people in different parts of society fare in that system. And I guess prior to that investment in education report, education was really reviewed as an expense and an obligation. And the report really marked a big shift in education being seen as valuable, I guess initially in terms of its economic value for individuals in society, but then a shift towards the societal value of what education can contribute. And I guess what was particularly important about that work, and I think Anya Hyland might be here today, I know she was part of that research group, was the really systematic data collection that they engaged in. So through really innovative surveys, pioneering models of data analysis, for the first time, the survey team overcame a dearth of information to provide an unprecedentedly comprehensive overview of the Irish education system. And it really was fundamental in shaping our understanding of the system. And stemming from that then, we had the emergence of education research in Ireland. Initially, probably at the Economic and Social Research Institute, and very much pioneered by Damien Hannon. Some of you may remember his work or remember him personally. He died a few years ago. But he was really profound in shaping education research from the 70s, 80s, and 90s onwards. And I want to talk just a moment about him and really his role in shifting our thinking about how we should view the education system and how we should view how different groups fare within it. So Damien Hannon played a leading role in the development of sociology as a discipline in Ireland and really published very extensively on the educational and labour market outcomes of young people. These are some of his early works, which this was what I was reading when I was in college. And really they were incredibly groundbreaking in the Irish context and indeed internationally. They really started to try and unpack how students fared within the school system, how different groups of students fared in terms of their engagement, their attainment, their performance, their access to different subjects, and really, really important pieces of work. And for the first time, we started asking students their views How do they feel about the education they're receiving? And that started really in the early 90s from Damien Hannon's work. So really a key moment in time for a lot of the work we do today. And I was really fortunate to graduate in 1994 and become a research assistant to Damien Hannon at the ESRI for the first 2 years of my career. I learned a huge amount. And as you can see, this kind of work was just critical to how we view education research today. So I want to reflect on the two main strands that I see kind of running somewhat in parallel, but somewhat integrated too. And I want to argue for a more kind of complementary view of how these two strands of work sit within our system. So the first kind of reflects on more rigorous, systematic, longitudinal, and causal methods. And I'm going to draw a little bit here on a Horizon Europe project I'm involved in, where we use a lot of these kinds of methodologies. But the second area, and I think the area probably we're even stronger in the Irish context, is that rich, reflective, systems-based qualitative work. A lot of the presentations I noticed today do come from that perspective, and I think it's extremely positive, and I think this is where Ireland could really be a leader. So in terms of the rigorous research, as I say, I want to draw on this Horizon Europe project I'm involved in, EFFECT, Enhancing Efficiency and Effectiveness in Education. And this study started about 1.5 years ago. It comprises experts in 5 countries: Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, ourselves, and up to last Sunday, Hungary as well. And I guess the focus here, and our starting point from the European Commission was, well, we really have a lack of evidence on what works in education in general. The United States are well ahead of us on this, and Europe has been quite slow to the game. So our study brings together education scientists, sociologists, psychologists, and economists. So very much a multidisciplinary focus to try and unravel what works for whom and how. And just some general objectives, so strengthen the quality of education, the cost effectiveness and efficiency of education in the EU, to enhance our knowledge about which policies can be effective and for whom, to enhance the accessibility of education across the EU, and to provide cost-benefit assessments to policymakers and practitioners. We cover all levels of the education system. It's an extremely ambitious project, from preschool, primary, second level, higher education, and lots of different methodologies, predominantly quantitative, but not solely, across these levels. A lot of use of kind of randomized controlled trials in other countries, not so much in Ireland. And I'll come back to that later. It's a 4-year study, so we're very much in the early stages of this study. But I've picked out what I think are 4 kind of illustrative studies that were published this year, early outputs from the work, that I think can illustrate just the value of how different types of quantitative work shape our understanding of the education system. The first looks at the value of cross-sectional data. It can be underestimated, I think, a lot of the time, but it's a nice piece of work that shows how cross-sectional survey data can really help understand how different groups fare. The second looks at the potential of PISA data. We have brilliant PISA data over time and across many countries, and this paper looks at how PISA data can help us to understand how students in different countries fare and their non-cognitive outcomes. The third, and probably, I think, one of the more important pieces so far from the study, is the value of longitudinal research. And I've picked out a paper from Ireland using our Growing Up in Ireland data to understand how early educational experiences shape these later outcomes, a really critical type of research. And finally, I've picked up an experimental study to show how different mechanisms can support student engagement and their academic self-concept. So it's just a quick run through of these before I really focus much more strongly on that second strand I mentioned. So with the current rise of youth well-being difficulties, it's really important to understand how schools can shape and support student well-being. So based on self-determination theory, myself and Caoimhe Dempsey, who is here, and Emma Farrell, used survey data from 2,243 secondary students in Ireland to look at how 3 aspects of students' lives: their sense of belonging at school, their perceived autonomy, the extent to which they have a voice, and their perceived competence, their academic self-concept. To what extent do those 3 areas relate to their well-being? and their self-assessed well-being. And we find, and how does this vary for different groups of students critically? We find that belonging and autonomy matter greatly for well-being. But the links between belonging and autonomy are stronger for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. From those from marginalised communities, these matter much more. This sense of belonging that Tomás spoke about and this sense of autonomy, having a voice. They matter much more critically for those students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. They also matter much more for students with special educational needs. And when you take account of how students report their belonging, their autonomy, and other aspects of their school experience, the gaps between students with special educational needs and those without disappear. So there's a fundamental role for schools in shaping well-being and supporting the well-being of students who are struggling in this space. So what's the policy message? Well, the importance of promoting belonging and facilitating student participation in decision-making. And this, as I say, has particular salience for those experiencing socioeconomic inequality or additional learning needs. A very neat and simplistic piece of work, but nonetheless very powerful. The second piece, as I said, is looking at PISA data. And we really have quite a lot of evidence now looking at how COVID impacted on student learning and how student learning stalled in many countries, but how that varied across countries and how the duration of school closures, for example, really impacted and really shaped to what extent students suffered learning losses. But there's been much less focus on students' non-cognitive outcomes. So this study, again by colleagues on the EFFECT project, looked at how skills like motivation, engagement, self-beliefs about abilities, how these matter and how these are shaped across different countries. So using the PISA 2022 data, they looked at three key variables. Again, the sense of belonging, a growth mindset, so the extent how students' own beliefs about the malleability of intelligence, and the frequency with which they're exposed to bullying. And across the countries studied, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a range of European countries, the evidence showed the absolutely short-term losses in sense of belonging immediately post-COVID, but a lot of recovery in many countries in the subsequent year. So by 2022, a lot of countries, student belonging had recovered. In terms of the growth mindset, that did decline across many countries during this period and hasn't necessarily recovered as well. But for all of these domains, the research shows, again, that there's a disproportionate impact on certain groups of students. And in this case, on girls, migrant students, and those from less advantaged backgrounds. So what's the policy message from this? Well, a need to focus on these non-cognitive, attitudinal, experiential measures, which are equally important for are obviously important for academic success, but are equally important in their own rights in terms of how students experience their education. And we really need to have a more comprehensive view of academic resilience. So a really nice piece of work, again, using PISA data. I think the third piece is really exciting, well, obviously because I'm involved in it, myself and Caoimhe Dempsey. And we draw on the longitudinal Growing Up in Ireland study to show how child, parent, and teacher factors across the transition from primary to second level shape later outcomes. In this case, they shape higher education entry and the chance of going on to college. And we show that expectations and teacher-child relationships at this early transition are really powerful influences on those later outcomes. So we show that low socioeconomic students finish primary school with lower academic self-concepts, and these self-concepts drop much more sharply on their transition into second level. Parental expectations for most students rise during this transition, but not so for students from less advantaged backgrounds. And of course, both of these sets of factors, those early self-concepts and those expectations, they're really important predictors of attainment 7 years later and whether these children subsequently go on to higher education. So parental expectations are particularly important for students from less advantaged backgrounds, so key issue for policy. But we also show that positive teacher-student relationships in early secondary school are also critical for young people. And even where low socioeconomic parents hold high expectations, these students also need positive teacher-student relationships to reach the same attainment level as their peers. So these factors are critically important in addressing gaps in progression and attainment in education. So what's the policy message? The importance of bolstering children's academic self-concepts early and sustaining those self-concepts through key transition points in the education system. That, of course, requires supporting parents, particularly those experiencing socioeconomic inequality, to hold high expectations for their children. And of course, it has a lot of relevance for teacher training and for school cultures that foster positive, equitable, and meaningful relationships. And finally, I want to just touch on one of the experimental studies that has been completed so far as part of this study. And it's looking at the causal effect of positive feedback on students' math self-concept using a randomized field experiment among primary school students in Hungary. And basically, the study finds that students who received positive feedback just at one point in time experienced improvements in their maths self-concepts temporarily. But the key finding, I think, of this study is that this was particularly so for girls. So given the global phenomenon that girls have lower self-concepts in maths, this is really powerful results. So teachers' feedback practices can shape gendered perceptions of ability. And positive feedback can significantly impact intrinsic motivation by influencing individuals' perceptions of competence and self-determination. So what's the policy message here? Positive feedback interventions can act as a policy lever for improving girls' self-concept in areas like maths. So this strand of work, it's really rigorous, quantitative research, theoretically grounded, and also using quasi-experimental work. I think a lot of the quantitative work in Ireland has stemmed from growing up in Ireland and children's school lives now as well, those kind of key longitudinal studies. PISA and TIMSS data and the work at the URC has been really critical here too. We have some occasional commission studies like the study of voluntary secondary schools in 2023, and earlier studies where we tracked cohorts of young adults through their secondary schools and into leaving school. I think, and I'll hopefully have time to come back to this at the end, I think it's a very exciting time in terms of the area of data linkage. We have a lot of activity going on. The CSO are leading fantastic work in terms of linking up data across the system, and that has huge potential for understanding pathways and processes and experiences across the education landscape. But I think overall, I think Ireland has been quite weak up to recently, and I'd say up to about 5 years ago, in terms of systematic evaluation and building systematic evaluation into programs and new programs and initiatives in the system. And I think some of the key barriers in this space has been funding. I think Tomas alluded to that. Expertise and critical mass. The lack of an interdisciplinary focus. I mean, so when I'm working in this effect work, the interdisciplinarity is really key to what we do. And I think that's a big part of what we need to develop in Ireland. I think there has been a lack of recognition of the importance of research, again, up until fairly recently. And even where good research has been happening, it doesn't consistently impact on policy and practice. But I think, again, that's rapidly changing. I think we've a lot of optimism there. So what I really want to talk about today is whose voices are heard and whose stories are told. And really, all that systematic and that quantitative work, for me, really provokes the question that we need a much deeper systemic and intersectional lens to really understand areas like educational inequality. And I think that's where the strength of Ireland may well be. So when we reflect back on Damien's work, I think 40 years ago, I think society has changed very dramatically, and as a consequence, of course, our research has to too. Society and schools have changed considerably. Schools are now at the front line of Ireland's efforts to integrate new Irish families, build an inclusive society for disabled people, and tackle intergenerational inequality. They are also increasingly sites of contestation and debate over deep social questions like the place of faith and secularism in public institutions, and the best path to ensuring that all young people thrive regardless of their gender or sexual orientation. So we inhabit a very different world to the world that Damien Hannan inhabited 40 years ago. And so, of course, our research and our methods and our questions have to change fundamentally. And I think this quote is one that I think captures there should be no numbers without stories and no stories without numbers. And I think that's where we really need to focus our attention as researchers into the future. I think we have to acknowledge that Ireland hasn't had a very strong tradition of student voice, and particularly in relation to teaching and learning matters. And I know my colleagues in DCU have been really strong in highlighting this as an issue. And we do have growing research projects where researchers act as facilitators of student voice, but school staff consulting students as part of their routine work is probably still less prominent than it should be. And definitely, participatory research traditionally hasn't been given the space and weight that it does deserve. And so these are the issues I really want to tackle now in the next few minutes. But I think in terms of policy and vision, we have a huge amount to be optimistic about. There's superb work going on in the Department of Education and Youth and the Department of Children and right across government. The student participation in education is just one really nice example of the vision here. The ISSU are now included on the NCCA, giving them a voice in key curricular decisions. There's a lot of work going on in terms of how student councils can shape decision making, and I know new guidance is currently being prepared to greatly enhance the role and contribution of student councils to student voice. And we really have seen a very useful shift towards a rights-based approach, giving students meaningful participation in decisions that affect them. So I think the vision is definitely there, the ambition is there, and I guess the question now is, has that or is that being translated into practice and experience on the ground? And I think we're starting to see a growing volume and a growing range of expertise on these kinds of more flexible and participatory research approaches in Ireland, which really centre on the direct engagement with participant cohorts who are directly affected by the policy or the study topic. And of course, there's a very wide spectrum of studies here, ranging from low levels of participation, which is really about consultation with key groups, towards more cooperative spaces where researchers work with the research cohort to consider priorities, but that the researchers retain that control, right through to co-production, where members of the community who are the focus of the research actually devise and conduct the research independently. And I think we're seeing examples even today across all of those. I think we probably need to see more and more shift towards that kind of participatory work, and that particularly that co-production type research. And I think one really exciting example of this, the Path4 program in universities, working with young adults with intellectual disabilities. There's currently 180 students involved in this program, getting QQI qualifications at level 4 to 6. And there really is a very strong co-production example here. There's a heavy emphasis on stakeholder engagement and student voice throughout the process. This program is surprisingly well funded and resourced, although it doesn't have certainty in terms of sustainability. And of course, supporting participant agency and autonomy in the research process does require a lot of methodological flexibility, and hopefully I'll have time to come to that at the end. But we've really nice examples of different levels of co-creation, from project level, network community research, into policy level. And these are just a few to illustrate the really great work going on across the education community in Ireland. The Inclusive Research Network is a network of people with disabilities doing their own research. It's a collaboration between UCC and UCD. And they are part of the decisions at all stages of the research. There's the RED framework, creating rights enabled by design. It's a collaboration between UCC, Queen's University Belfast, and Praxis Care. And this is really exciting because it aims to generate a participatory methods toolkit, quality standards, and training resources to improve inclusive practices in research. So that's really promising work. I think Research Ireland have been groundbreaking in this space as well. So following really extensive consultation with the disabled researchers, they've developed a pilot disability policy and supplemental grant to support researchers with disabilities to participate in their grants. So, for example, they can receive supplementary budget for the costs of required reasonable accommodations. Really positive developments there. And we know that there was great work between the independent living movement, the DPO network, and government in the development of the National Human Rights Strategy for Disabled People, 2025 to 2030. Superb work, internationally renowned, I would say this piece will be. A really nice policy example of collaborative design. So we have a lot of really good things happening in our system. I want to talk about just a couple of research illustrations from work at the ESRI, recent work, to show the importance of student voice and the importance of these kinds of collaborative approaches. I won't have time to cover all 4 of these, but maybe 2 of them. So last year, or 2023, we undertook research for the JMB to look at how students fared and how they experienced their schooling in the voluntary secondary sector. So it was a study that took a mixed method approach. So we selected 21 case study schools, which were selected to capture huge diversity across the education landscapes of schools with different social mix, gender mix, and regionally diverse. And within those, we conducted really detailed surveys with students in 2nd and 5th year, but we also conducted really in-depth interviews with them, their parents, teachers, school leaders, and across the key stakeholders across the education community. So we conducted really rich quantitative and qualitative. We gathered rich quantitative and qualitative measures. But crucially, we also situated what we gathered in wider data collection systems. So we used questions from Growing Up in Ireland and from PISA studies so that we could situate our findings from these 21 schools in wider databases, and we could contextualize how these students were experiencing different aspects of their school life. I think one of the key things that came out from the study, well, there's a lot in it, it's a huge report, and I recommend people read it if they have an interest in really understanding secondary education. But one of the things that really captured a lot of attention at the time, particularly media attention, was the role of kind of school gender mix and how students felt about school gender mix. And so I'm going to reflect just for a moment on what that study said and how it helps in our kind of understanding of student voice. So we haven't had any new single-sex schools since 1988, but there's been a slow and steady decline in the proportion of students in single-sex schools, but we still have a very sizable cohort. And Ireland is still closer to Egypt, Qatar, and Bahrain than any European country in the proportion enrolled in single-sex schools. So that's quite a statement. So of course, we have to ask students how they feel about this. And I guess we weren't surprised that students were strongly in favor of co-education, but we were surprised by the magnitude of the preference. So 14% of respondents in the single-sex schools preferred their school's gender mix compared to 87% of their peers in co-educational schools. That's a very stark finding. And you have to ask why students haven't been asked these questions more. And of course, we asked them then, well, why do they feel like that? And that was pretty clear. By far, the most frequent code was mixed socialization is good, referring to the benefits of young people being socialized together rather than separately. They also highlighted benefits in terms of a preparation for the gender mix young people would experience in their post-school lives. But really, there's a very clear sentiment over why they felt co-education might be a better design and organization for our system. But we did dig a bit deeper as well. We asked them, well, do they feel that single-sex or co-education is better in terms of their academic development, their social development, or their personal development? And here we get a bit more of a nuanced story. And so there's a lot of positivity about co-education in terms of social and personal development, but much more diverse views in relation to how students fare academically. So it's not as clear-cut as maybe first seems. But this study, I guess, also highlighted that students were really critical about their voice and involvement in school decision-making processes. Only a quarter believe that they have a say in what happens in their school. That's a really depressing statistic. And a quarter, again, feel that their views will be taken into account if they wanted to make a change in their school. They're strong findings. And I think with the convention next year, it's a really opportune time to look at how student experiences and how students feel about their school, how they can shape the future of our school system. And then earlier this year, we published a really large-scale piece of work for the National Council for Special Education on how young adults with different types of disabilities and additional needs fare when they leave school. So we have a really large body of research looking at how students with disabilities experience their primary and second level schools now as a consequence of growing up in Ireland data particularly. But we have much less understanding about what happens when they leave school and what pathways and opportunities do they have. So we undertook, it took about 2.5 years, a very large-scale piece of work centred on the experiences of disabled young adults, looking at their preparedness for leaving school, their skills development, their planned and realised pathways, their experiences of the transition, the first 4 or 5 months post-transition, and their outlook for the future. And the study really provides very important evidence for our system on really concerning gaps between their school and post-school lives, in relation to the adequacy of the supports they receive, the resourcing of non-mainstream education and training programs, and the pathways and progression opportunities for different groups of young people. We saw a lot of variation in the availability of programs and settings according to need, impairment, and location, geographic location. So the study was deeply mixed method again. So we did a lot of survey work in special and mainstream schools and in a range of post-school education settings. But crucially, we did really in-depth work. We did case study work in 8 special school settings, which really formed the core of this study. And that work really helped us to really get a sense of what are the key challenges here for policy going forward. And we were really struck by how appreciative the young adults and their families were in terms of being asked about their experiences. And quite a few of them said, this is the first time we've been asked, you know, especially when they had left school, 4 or 5 months after leaving school. The young adults and their parents said, this is the first time we've been asked how Mary is doing since she left school. So it was a really important opportunity for them to share their experiences and to really highlight what are some gaps and deficits in the system. And I guess if I was to highlight just a couple of the key kind of headline findings, was that overall many of the young adults reflected really positively, particularly on their school experiences and their preparation for leaving school and the efforts that went in to preparing them and the kinds of skills and competencies they developed for their post-school lives. There were really positive reflections on the system around profiling the needs of different groups of young adults, particularly in special school settings, and the most appropriate placement for them, and that work undertaken by the HSE. But there were concerns over the timeliness and the adequacy of HSE funding for young adults when they left school, and big concerns over the provision of transport support for them to access different types of training provision. But I think one of the biggest issues that emerged for us was the readiness of service providers. That was a huge concern for quite a number of the cohort of young adults leaving special school settings. And for them, then they experienced delayed or frustrated transitions. And this was really the biggest barrier for quite a number in terms of a smooth transition. And this, of course, reflected the severe recruitment and retention crisis in adult day services. And as a consequence, placements were delayed or hours were cut. And just some quotes from some parents and a principal here. And it had a profound impact on the lives of these young adults who often were left sitting at home. And I think when we presented the first time, we asked the question, would this be allowed if this was a cohort of students in higher education? No, it wouldn't be acceptable. But for these young adults, this has been going on for a number of years, and they haven't been accessing the supports and the provision that they need to continue their learning and their progression in the education system. So that was a really concerning finding for us. The second one was the whole area of a social cliff. And this is very much a hidden loss. Parents were really gushing about the rich social life of the schools they attended, the camps, the classes, the diversity of the activities within school, after school, just the huge opportunities for these young adults when they're in school, in their school days, but that they disappear once they leave school. And this was, again, a really stark finding. Once they hit adulthood, there's no literature coming in the door advertising all of these activities and opportunities. Now is when they need social interaction. They're adults sitting in houses. So the study really points to the importance of that longitudinal, that life course perspective, and that, of course, the journey doesn't end at 18. And that's really the heart of this particular study, ensuring that when parents have to step back and when parents aren't able to continue to provide the supports, the society steps forward. And that really does require a much more joined up approach across government departments and agencies to ensure that we build a landscape where every young person's path continues, not ends at 18. If I have time, how am I doing for time?
10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So a lot of what I've talked about, and even a lot of what Tomas talked about as well, moves us towards seeing the system in a much more holistic, whole of education way. And I think the CANALTAS action plan on bullying has really exemplified a much more mature policy environment in Ireland. One that is informed by research, shaped by consultation with young people, schools and wider communities, and embedded in legal and in international human rights frameworks. So it really illustrates this broader shift in Irish educational policy and research, and move from reactive, school-level procedures towards more integrated, proactive strategies that address systemic inequalities and promote student well-being as a collective responsibility. And that's a key message I want to get across today, and that's where we're at now, hopefully, and that's where we're going to move into the future. That this systemic, holistic, contextualized approach is really, really important in how we understand the educational system and how individuals fare within it. We subsequently applied this approach then to try to understand inclusion in education, myself and colleagues at DCU, Neil Kenny and James O'Higgins-Norman. And it really proved to be a very useful lens for understanding inclusion in education, and points towards the importance of integrated, multi-elemental focus on supporting collaboration among stakeholders in the area of inclusion. And this is quite a nice paper to kind of illustrate that importance. But I think only until relatively recently, the voices of marginalised groups, particularly those with complex disabilities, has been sparse within the research literature and even the qualitative research literature in Ireland. And obviously that has a consequent impact on policy development. We've made a lot of assumptions about capability, capacity, and ability to give informed consent and to participate effectively. And of course, this has removed their voice in key decisions. So I think we've made a lot of assumptions in terms of who does academic research. There's been a lot of academic ableism, ableist normativity. And really, academia has been designed without the disabled academic in mind. And we need to provide a much more positive and inclusive academic space that welcomes all different types of researchers. And of course, as I've been really focused on today, we need to include all voices within that. We need to include the perspectives and lived experiences of individuals, particularly those with disabilities, and particularly those presenting with complex communication and cognitive profiles, and across different groups of stakeholders representing those individuals. And of course, this raises lots of complexities for research, and it makes it in many ways more challenging, but it's critically important. And I think from our research in special schools in particular, we kind of highlight on the left there just some of the key challenges that we need to take account of when we're doing this kinds of research. There's a huge burden on schools, and all schools are busy and dealing with lots of research requests, but perhaps more so in special school settings. So that's a particular demand for them. We need to take a lot of thought on instrument design and individualized planning. So there needs to, and this requires much more time and more resources to develop tailored instruments, adapted interview elicitation techniques, and to establish rapport with these young adults. And of course, as I say, it has to be a systems level approach. The student is the unit, but they can only be understood within their broader school and community context. I'm highlighting some work here from Neil Kenny, and if you want to read one thing from what I've presented today, this is really, really good. They use a transformative paradigm to facilitate change by promoting equality and societal accessibility, empowerment of individuals with disabilities in an aim to bring about positive real-world service outcomes for these individuals. It's a form of engaged inquiry and research. So the criteria for evaluating studies is much more, it's difference study makes, is the difference the study makes to service provision, or to the social needs or objectives identified as being meaningful for disabled individuals. And so they provide some really valuable guidance on what kinds of approaches and when we're adopting this kinds of research in consultation, cooperation, and co-learning, and how we can do this within the constraints of time, of course, ethical barriers, and budgetary constraints. But they provide really nice guidance in terms of gathering information on participant profiles, adopting inclusive research methods, for example, fully inclusive environments which facilitate the use of individualized supports, adapting data collection approaches using visual representation, adapting language and communication style using assistive technology, and of course the whole area of elicitation techniques, nonverbal, photo voice, drawings, visual representation, as well as different types of verbal representation. It's a really nice piece of work, and I think it can be really useful for all of us as we endeavour to do this kind of research. Yeah, so to conclude, I think what I'm trying to say is that voice and representation matters in so many ways. And in addressing inequality and really looking at it in that kind of intersectional and systemic way, we have to capture voice in a very nuanced and deep way. Of course, all of this is important for supporting engagement and well-being, for fostering cultural awareness and respect. I didn't have time to talk about this today, but it's critical in this space. And of course, for creating meaningful voice and opportunities for all. We need much more contextualized research where everyone, regardless of background, need, or communication ability, has the opportunity to contribute and shape decisions about them. Of course, that does not remove the need for rigorous data and rigorous empirical research, and the two are certainly not mutually exclusive. We don't have a strong tradition of using experimental or quasi-experimental evaluation designs. We need to do a lot better there. We have started becoming much stronger in building review, evaluation, and measures of success into the policy creation process, and I think we've made great strides there over the last 5 years in particular. But ultimately, we have to base policy on systematic and systemic data, and the lived experience is especially important. And of course, all of this has the potential to address current policy concerns, but also anticipate future issues. And of course, one final comment, we've got this very, very rich Growing Up in Ireland data, and it's hugely beneficial for the research community, and I think it has huge potential in identifying potential levers for change. So I think I would appeal to people to really try to use what's there as well. But I have to say that these two strands that I've taken through, they're certainly not mutually exclusive. They're complementary and overlapping, and they each have a very important role to play in understanding our education system and how individuals within it fare. I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Celine, thank you so much. That, I have to say, I know you're experienced, deeply experienced and an expert in your space, but that was a masterful, I think, presentation and keynote. Lots of messages for us to reflect on there. I think one thing that occurred to me as you were speaking was, across a number of different areas, the interface between schools and their communities becoming a really pertinent issue, a cross-cutting issue. But you struck a lovely balance between the clarion call, particularly as exemplified in that last slide on the one hand, but given its real kind of deeper dives into actual research pieces as well. So it was really well balanced overall. And the other, yes, I love that quote. I probably have it the wrong order now, but no stories without numbers and no numbers without stories. Whatever the order is, but I think the point was really a critical one in all of this. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, because we're trying to be as inclusive as possible with everyone else in the room, we don't have time for Q&A with Selena here formally, but she'll be around for the rest of the event, hopefully. And you might be reflecting on this as we go forward. On your tables, yes. On your tables, I hope this works, you will see a QR code for a Menti. And it can be 2 seconds. Where I can call, excellent, yes. So we want you to give us what one word would you like to hear throughout today. Some of you have already been ahead of us, which is great. And so just enter that in. So thinking ahead to the parallel sessions, we have an input from Professor Cathy Hall. We'll have a plenary discussion later on. Be thinking about what one word you'd like to hear, and we'll see how that pops up. Before I introduce Selena, I'm constantly to the coffee break, so I'll try and keep this as tight as possible. I did talk about Help Us Connect. So in the parallel sessions you're about to go into after coffee, we have deliberately put the presentations back to back, 3 to 4 papers per session, and to have a single session of Q&A. Rather than Q&A per paper or per presentation, we've deliberately grouped the Q&A time per session into one block of about 20 minutes. With the intention of when you're giving your comments or your questions, try and see across the papers. Try and join the dots, as Selena did in her keynote. So there are specific elements within it, but she was also drawing patterns as she went along. So we want you to be thinking about that in terms, yes, if there's something really grabs your attention, obviously you want to talk to that person in particular, but in that open Q&A within the sessions, try and pick up on the patterns. What is the research telling us that we need to pay attention to, as Selena was doing in her keynote? And with that in mind, a bit like the Rhine line of the 80s, show my age here, the Menti will remain open at different parts throughout the day. During each of the breaks, as you come away from the session, we ask you to come into the same code and think about, one, what connections are you noticing between what people are saying? One insight or idea, only one, and there are tons, but one insight or idea from what you have heard in that session that we should think about for the future of education, as Selena was emphasizing there at the end. And one question you still have. Those who've heard me speak before, I've told the story so many times, but my second year in UCD, Hugh Goff, doing the French Revolution in cartoons in something small room up in the arts block. And he closed his lecture by saying the nirvana of academic endeavor was not the perfect answer, but the perfect question. I'll never, ever forget it. So at the end of all your insights and your connections, what question do you still have? And we'll be gathering this Menti feedback as we go along, and afterwards, how we take this network forward and continue to co-create it with yourselves, looking at the questions people still have, looking at the insights. So it's a little bit unusual format, and it may not work out perfectly, but that's okay, we're trying things out. But in the breaks, after the sessions, go back into your Menti if you wouldn't mind, and look, those questions will be there in the Menti when you go away, and it'll be moved on. Connections you're noticing, one insight or idea, a question you still have. We have 6, Celine picked up on herself, such a diversity of input in the parallel sessions. And I said the level of interest was huge. We had almost 400 submissions. We didn't expect half that number. So we couldn't get a fraction of what was there. But we're hoping to maybe look at some webinar possibilities in the new year where those who weren't successful in presenting here today will have a chance to present to members of FIRU over time. But here today, in person, there are 6 parallel sessions. 2 of the rooms are on the floor here. The other 3 are upstairs. I see Sarah there at the back. She's my oracle in all of this. So she'll be helping you when you know where you want to be or where you want to go, which room. If you have any question about where to go or where the rooms are, there'll be staff on the floor to guide you. And we do have then in the space around the coffee, I'm sure you've noticed, a number of stands from aegis bodies, the Teaching Council, the NCCA, the Education Research Centre, the State Exams Commission, as well as the Convention on Education. In that space, you can feel free to dip into that. But if you could be at your parallel sessions for around 11:30, and we go straight through to lunch then, which I think is down here on the right, is that correct? Yep. And then after lunch, we hear from Cathy Hall, more parallel sessions. And please, if you can, hang around for the plenary session at the end, because we want to draw the strands together. So it's fabulous. We have chief executives of agencies presenting PhD research right across all sorts of other inputs from teachers and principals and so on. But we want to leverage the connections here in sustainable, meaningful ways. And we want you to help us do that, if you wouldn't mind, in the closing session. So I know it's a long day, But if you could bear with us, we'd really appreciate your input at that point as well. Have I forgotten anything, Sarah, and all of that? Perfect. So enjoy your coffee, enjoy your chats, and then see you in your respective rooms around 11:30. Gur míle míle maith againn.
Hello? Okay. So, hello everybody. Welcome to the morning session of the systems strand of the conference. I've been asked by Ian and Tomas to chair this session, but also to speak first. So, the strange experience of introducing myself. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me, the great, the wonderful. Now, I'm going to set my timer, so bear with me. So, apologies for the delay. There was a few technical glitches there with Mac to PC issues. So, thanks for your patience. Yeah, okay. Now, I must apologize in advance because my presentation is it's quite visual. So not tons of words, so there's a lot of slides, so I'm going to be flicking fast. I have a QR code at the end if anybody wants to contact me afterwards, and I can send on the PDF, or indeed, maybe the organisers are doing that anyway. So I'm a design educator, so I teach design. Sorry, I'm going to have to stand like this. I teach out in IADT, the Institute of Art Design Technology. So I've, over the last 20 years, kind of, I suppose, built up an experience. Program chair for a decade, curriculum author for the last 2 iterations of the program. I'm sure third level people are familiar with programmatic review. And a teacher. The thing that I love the most is teaching design, which ultimately is this intangible, difficult to explain subject. And I think that's where I've become really fascinated with how do we make what I suppose the 21st century skills, which mostly is what design is, how do we make invisible skills visible? So that's become my my passion really. Aside from that, I stepped back from chairing about 3-4 years ago.